welcome. My name is thought-provoking. Most of you know me. Today, the Kroc Seminar Series is really pleased to welcome three people who know their field inside and out. Two experts from across the ocean and one right here in the room with us. We're going to be talking about tomorrow's humanitarian negotiations. A little bit of housekeeping first, and then I'm going to pass things over to Bruno, whom I'm going to introduce. Number one, happy election day here for those of you in the United States. I know it's a sort of high tension, high stress sort of thing, but if we could just sort of breathe in, breathe out, act a little stoic, let go of what you cannot control, that would be great. There are plenty of resources, emotional, mental, and otherwise on campus and within the school, so take advantage of them. I also want to thank Daria Tomsky here, who is becoming a pretty indispensable part of like the lifeblood of the school, and has put this all together for us. I'm sorry that our online participants can't enjoy lunch, but we'll enjoy some for you. I also just want to thank Bruno Husquinet. Here he's on the screen here. He's in the bottom square, and I'm going to introduce him in a second. But this was all his idea to pull together these two people, Pierre and Will here, for this talk today. I want to acknowledge the online audience. Sometimes people say that hybrid events are the worst of both worlds, but I think here in this case, like we really couldn't have done this otherwise, and it's really wonderful to see so much expertise sort of not in one place, but in one setting. I think it is being recorded. Is that right, Daria?
Yes.
So just so that you know that, and not necessarily for posterity, but for all those folks who can't necessarily join us today. Okay, so I want to just sort of set a little bit of context. Hopefully it's not going to be too much of a bleak picture. But when we think about humanitarian negotiations and their importance going forward into the future, one of Pierre's colleagues in Geneva, Achim Benven, recently came out with a short policy report about this sort of what he called an era of radical uncertainty for several reasons. One of those is pandemics. I won't sort of beleaguer that point. We all lived through that. Another is population growth. There's expected to be basically a doubling of population in the least developed countries from between now and 2050, from say 900 million people to 1.9 billion people. And many of those are going to obviously be in a youth bulge at that point. Urbanization, there will be 2.5 billion more people in urban areas, mostly in Asia and Africa by 2050. That is an increase of over 90% over 2014 at least. Yeah, so 90% of that is going to be occurring in Africa and Asia. Most of that will be occurring in what are today medium-sized cities of less than 1 million people. We've grown to more than 1 million people. This will place tremendous strain on urban infrastructure, potentially setting the stage for a kind of new era of urban violence, much as Latin America saw in the wake of its own period of rapid urbanization following the civil wars of the 1980s and 1990s. Today, Latin America accounts for only about 9% of the world's population, but about 30% of the world's violent firearms homicide. Rising sea levels will put 10% of the world's population in harm's way by 2050. And if we just think about some of the major cities of the world that are at risk, we can think of Ho Chi Minh City, we could think of Bangkok, we could think of Shanghai, we could think of New York, we could think of many places that sit at sea level. Climate displacement. In the US, it is expected that 1 in 12 people by 2050 will have been on the move, have moved generally out of the southern states and out of the central states, towards the west, here towards the northeast. In China, food production in the North China Plain is projected to decline dramatically, putting, say, up to 400 million people's food supply in jeopardy. In India, extreme heat waves are already becoming a norm and are projected to become more extreme. Downstream states of major rivers are increasingly seen as being risk, sort of flashpoints for internal conflict, not necessarily international conflict. So we can think of Iraq on the Tigris and Euphrates downstream of Turkish dam projects. We can think of Egypt on the Nile downstream of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We can think of Pakistan downstream of India and the Chenab and other rivers. You can sort of go down the list. We're also looking, following a kind of long period of fairly monotonic declines in rates of violent conflict globally. I think we're all sort of in this familiar with the fact that since 2006, roughly, we have witnessed a steady climb back up, and many of our students and even faculty here are from now conflict-affected countries. So we can think of obviously Ukraine and Gaza, most obviously, but Nigeria, Sudan, Cameroon, Brazil, Myanmar, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Burkina Faso, Mali. The list is much, much longer than this. But we have seen a sort of crumbling of democratic institutions in West Africa and elsewhere. The political context is one of resurgent nationalism. So no matter who wins this election, in this particular election in the United States, the neoliberal project that was sort of characterized by kind of radical vision of democratic pluralism that has come under sustained assault over the past few years. Neither major candidate in this country is now going to be rolling out any sort of welcome mat. In fact, right, we all sort of seen the rally cries of mass deportation now. So all of the displacement that we were just talking about is likely not going to find an outlet in many countries in the West. And after a kind of brief time of maybe unipolar, maybe multipolar world politics, we're seeing this kind of rise of a liberal resistance bloc led by China, but also extending to North Korea, to Iran, to Russia. And so, one very sort of poignant example of that just today is that for the very first time today, Ukrainian troops have engaged in conflict with North Korean troops who were given permission by China to cross their territory and fight for the Russians. So that we're seeing a sort of cohesion and a cohesiveness of this bloc in terms of conflict, in addition to in terms of politics. And we also, and I think as we'll be talking about more during the presentation, we also this is a moment of decolonization, to sort of move away from classic liberal, oftentimes Eurocentric or US-centric modes of interaction. So what does that mean for us? So all of that sort of speaks to a need for humanitarian and peace negotiations in this near future, middle future. Peace negotiations, I think for many of you who will likely already know, but this is kind of the middle tier of a broad spectrum of strategies that includes dialogue and dialogue support, it includes facilitation, that includes negotiation support, includes mediation support, includes mediation itself. So with that, I want to introduce folks who actually know what they're talking about. And the first of whom will be Bruno Husquinet. He's the head of the sub-office for UNFPA. Hello. Welcome. In northern Ethiopia, he oversees the response to the Tigray conflict and others. Previously, he was global team leader for Elbatas, overseeing their humanitarian response and preparedness. Bruno has about 20 years in the humanitarian sector, worked for the UN, the EU, MSF, ICRC, in predominantly fragile and conflict-affected contexts. He speaks French, as many of you will have heard as you came in, Russian, English. He's used those languages to negotiate for humanitarian access. He does us the great honor of sitting on the board of advisors for the MASHA program, the Master of Science in Humanitarian Action here. And he will be co-facilitating, I would say actually just like lead facilitating the conversation with me, joining us, I think from Addis Ababa, is that where you currently are?
In Nairobi.
Oh, in Nairobi, okay. So welcome, thank you for being with us, Bruno, and please, everybody, if we could just like, I'll just hand it off to you.
Thank you, Topher. I think you did set the scene pretty well. So my turn to welcome actually the real speakers. Philippe Gamaghelyan is, as you know, an associate professor at the Kroc School of Peace Studies, where he teaches courses in conflict analysis and resolution, mediation, media, nationalism and conflict, and many others. I think most of the students know you, Philippe. You are as well the author of Conflict Resolution Beyond the International Relations Paradigm, focusing on Nagorno-Karabakh and Syria. Philippe is a conflict resolution scholar and practitioner. He is the co-founder and board member of the Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation and editor at the Caucasus edition, which is a journal of conflict transformation. His research is focusing mainly on politics of memory in conflict contexts and on the critical reevaluation and design of conflict resolution interventions. Welcome, Philippe, and very honored to have you today. From Geneva, Pierre Hazan is a senior advisor with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which most of you probably know is a leading organization in armed conflict mediation. He has advised international organizations, government, armed groups on various issues from justice, amnesty, reparation, truth commission, forced disappearance, and many other topics. Pierre worked with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, collaborated with the United Nations in the Balkans, was a member of the International Contact Group on the Basque conflict, and he has been working in numerous conflict zones in Africa, Balkan, Middle East, and Europe, where he is still very much active. Pierre also founded the Justice Info Net, which is a media outlet dedicated to justice issues in societies in transition. He's also been teaching at Sciences Po in Paris and the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Last but not least, his new book was released recently in 2024 and also translated even more recently into English. The title is quite telling: Negotiating with the Devil Inside the World of Armed Conflict Mediation. And in his book, he critically looks at the evolution of mediation and the moral dilemmas faced by negotiators, including his own dilemmas all through his career. So Pierre is joining from Geneva, and an honor to welcome you today as well, Pierre. So I think to now really kick off the discussion and warm up a little bit the stage, I'll ask you both to perhaps detail how have you become mediators and what motivates you to continue being a practitioner and scholar in mediation. And I'll give first the floor to Philippe, being the only in-person for this talk.
Thank you, Topher. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll try to be short to give most of the time to others since you have more chance to see me. Also, you know probably more about me. So the short story is that I grew up in a conflict zone, grew up in Armenia, one of the post-Soviet states during the war, the First Karabakh War. I seen some of the consequences, lost some friends in that war, supported the war myself as well. Volunteered, again, luckily for me, even my age, time was pretty young, didn't end up fighting. Then seeing the consequences, and in particular, the consequences of the violence done by my own side, which is not something I had in mind when I was volunteering, created some sense of responsibility down the road. And that led me kind of my second professional career. First, I was a business person, first funding peace building and human rights organizations, and later increasingly volunteering, and then moving myself into this space, trying to do something to prevent the next war or in some form resolve. So the commitment has been very much to, in that sense, to practice, and specifically in my own conflict context, but also, as increasingly also trying to support colleagues in other countries, especially in the neighborhood where I'm from, in Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, and where else, occasionally also border. So that's the kind of how I got into this myself. Initially, as many of us probably have been trained in what we called the topic called the Eurocentric model, where the trainings really came from, studying in the West, what through training programs and also through formal education. And that to a degree made sense to me in thousands when I started studying. And I got pretty actively engaged in also mediation in practice as well, not the only practice, but also mediation. And among other things, again, they're on camera, so some of it I won't go too much detail because of some confidentiality issues, but mediated ceasefires, at least two that where the directive was involved, also contributed to some peace agreement texts. Looked pretty successful initially, but then down the road started having serious questions about the somewhat technocratic approach to conflict resolution. Even though specifically in the room we could get somewhere, and again, things like ceasefires were negotiated and maybe held for a while, in the big pictures, things continue to deteriorate. For example, in Nagorno-Karabakh, where again, I'm the most intimately involved with the peace process, despite a couple of ceasefires that held up for a year or two, we ended up in a full-scale war. And another round of ethnic cleansing, this time of Armenians, and the first time was mostly Azerbaijanis. So again, yes, kind of step by step, we seemed to have success, but in the big picture, didn't necessarily, right? So we ended up in a war. But I started seeing even bigger problems as I started working in other regions, so in Ukraine and Syria in particular. We are also witnessing, of course, Gaza and many other contexts that Topher was mentioning. And there was this question of, maybe in a room we know how to lead this, so there's enough technical knowledge, doesn't necessarily contribute to solution in any bigger picture sense. So in that sense, as mediation is just a piece of a puzzle, it's not necessarily everything, right? So like all the changes that are happening, politically and otherwise structurally, they are not necessarily helpful or leading towards less violence, as we presumed will be the case in 1990s. So that led me to come back to academia and just realize that in somewhat master's degree and somewhat more technocratic approach to mediating actually is a problem. Even I question my own ceasefire negotiations because they in a way put a band-aid on it and maybe stop the violence for a year or two, but potentially contributed then to eruption of actually the war itself because we couldn't really solve more structural issues. So that's my kind of background and what led me to negotiations, to academia, and then looking into peace building field in general, but so I'm more from peace building than humanitarian action, and mediation as a piece of a puzzle quite critically. So, thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I'll pass the floor to Pierre now.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and happy election day. And I hope that you'll be happy with the results, and the rest of the world as well. I would just say that I'm originally from the Middle East, and for political reasons, we had to leave, so we came as refugees to Switzerland. So I guess that triggered my interest to do something in that field. I study international relations and international law. And for 20 years, I followed conflicts, especially in the 90s, in the Balkans, and in so many places, including the genocide in Rwanda and again, so many other places. And you know, the 90s is a fascinating period because it's a period first of hope and then of despair, but it's a time there are a lot of questions which are being asked regarding how do you deal at the end of a conflict? How do you deal with justice and peace? How are you going to articulate different priorities? So I got very much interested in truth commissions, in reparations, in human rights, and also trying to articulate such an approach with a political process, which is very often extremely cynical, short-term, pragmatic. So this combination of these tensions was for me extremely interesting. And so I decided basically to do a PhD at one point. And one day I received at midnight a phone call asking me if I wanted to join an organization doing mediation in armed conflicts. And it was the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And that's basically how I decided to join this organization, and a fascinating world, I have to say.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Thank you very much, Philippe. So after this quick introduction, let's perhaps like crack the core of the discussion, right? I think it has been said in his introduction by Topher. We are now facing a little bit the failure of this old Eurocentric model. And both of you, Pierre and Philippe, are very, very critical of the way negotiation was done in the past. You've again flagged it in your brief introduction. You have been promoting decolonizing mediation. Pierre, in your book, Negotiating with the Devil, you present the 2011 conflict in Libya as a turning point that is ending 2 decades of Pax Americana. Philippe, in a recent article about the renewed violence between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, you say, and I quote you, the US and the EU that returned to the region following the start of the war in Ukraine should develop long-term strategies and make them explicit. At the present time, partnership with the collective West is a high-cost endeavor for the countries of the South Caucasus. It contains existential risks. To date, you conclude, the West has proved to be an opportunistic and unreliable partner. So I'll give the floor first to Pierre to elaborate a little bit on your critical view of negotiations, a little bit.
Well, I mean, obviously criticism is good, but for me, the most important is we're changing paradigm. Basically, the order of World War II and after the Cold War are crumbling, and it's a new world which is appearing, and the Security Council is too much divided, and international law is not respected. We can think about Gaza, we can think about Sudan, we can think about Ukraine and so many other places. So we are facing a very, very different world, which is polycentric, with a lot of new challenges. The question is how we can deal with this new map. And that's for me the real question. In the past, obviously, the UN was a key mediator, and we think about the 90s, obviously, in Guatemala, in Namibia, in Nepal, in so many countries. It was basically the UN, and a lot of people, you know, in 1992, the Secretary General has published the Agenda for Peace, and there was even the embryo of a UN army. When you think about it today, it sounds ridiculous. So, I mean, the world has changed so much. The question is, we have now the UN being marginalized and basically a paralyzed Security Council. So we need different tools. And we see also that the traditional mediators like Norway or Switzerland are no more effective. We see new actors appearing. And we understand also that there are local mediators which are playing a very important role in many conflicts. So there is something on one hand, we need basically to despair about the challenges and the person who made the initial painting was exactly right about all the challenges facing us. But in the same time, I believe there are some tools to approach the new challenges in front of us.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. Philippe, your take.
So thank you. First of all, mostly agree, of course, with everything we just heard. And although the question is critiquing the Eurocentric model, and I am quite critical, of course, but don't want to also confuse criticism with the suggestion to discard it altogether for a couple of reasons. It could be effective depending on a place and a time. An example, being Eurocentric, the model is quite endemic as in local, essentially for Europe itself, and as a result, it has been quite functional, especially in the Western Europe, but to an extent also in Eastern Europe, especially also preventing some conflicts and potentially to really putting the lead on others, such as in the Balkans. But potentially also because, right, so we shouldn't say time confuse the effectiveness of it even there with only things like mediation and peace building, because it came in a package with many other structural, political, and social and economic developments in Europe. In a way, why I say it is local and works there, because the social contract essentially in some form is upheld, and both in a like Hobbesian sense, so security-wise, the Western European states through war are able to provide security effectively in the territory they hold, but also in a John Locke's version of social contract, essentially this exchange between the state and the population, and a certain degree of homogenization, cultural and so on, is achieved within these territories through wars, through decades, if not centuries. Plus, there is tiredness of wars that was around after World War II and World War I together in 20th century that kind of led to certain desire to avoid major conflicts. So it's quite again specific time and place that what we call now liberal peace building developed and works in that space. So might as well continue wherever or as long as it's possible. Also, when we had to go into the 1990s, it was a period where overall there seemed to be certain degree of consensus in maybe not everywhere, but in at least the territory of Europe, about the possibility of somehow replicating the European model. In that sense, really copy-pasting European approaches and going a bit technocratic total solutions, pragmatic made sense. That changed, right? So we see, of course, I think there is no question anymore that that model doesn't work. Conflicts are escalating, and essentially practically none of them are solved through necessarily liberal peace building. In the prevention happened maybe in the case of two, but not necessarily once violence escalated. We have some ceasefires, but we don't have necessarily any kind of solutions as such. So the question is then where to go from here. And my concern a bit is that I'm very critical, but once we go critical, somehow it seems like we're critical of the model. We need to discard everything, right? So I think a lot of the colleagues who are trying to decolonize are trying to reinvent or invent completely new approaches. And that's not necessarily how things work, right? So if even revolution, everything builds on the past. It's usually a transformation. As radical as the idea is, the implementation is usually, or has to be, I say, evolutionary. So in that sense, my proposal is you need to think of the pieces of liberal peace building, as kind of quite useful, whatever works, and still employ them, while not necessarily accepting the bigger picture proposition of liberal peace as end of history and the solution to conflicts through this model. So I think, again, separating and essentially discarding, questioning the bigger picture, while at the same time accepting a lot of the practicality of existing tools which were all developed in this model. So that's overall where I'm potentially standing now, that I think we don't have better than the models we had, while we are working towards finding new ones. So I'll step there then.
Thanks a lot, Philip. I think you both touched already like about the future, right? I mean, I think you both have mentioned, Toffer as well in his introduction, mentioned that international norms, international law are less and less observed. We see violence being also very much deregulated. You know, where conflict starts and stops today is something very complex. We see mediation, but as well humanitarian aid being instrumentalized. So in this context, right, we're not sure where we're going to, but how do you see mediation evolving in this world that is moving away from this unipolar world that we know into this multipolar world that you've been talking about? That we see, that this world being characterized by the rise of alternative model, call it autocracies, call it otherwise. We see also, as you mentioned, Pierre and Philippe, new actors, right? Regional actors in the Middle East. But we see Russia, we see China, we see Turkey, we see Qatar, which are new deal breakers as well in this world of mediation. So give us your thoughts about how you see tomorrow's mediation in armed conflicts.
Well, if I am to start, I will say that, I mean, the main phenomenon for me has been recently the fact that we moved to the liberal peace paradigm to transactional deals. Let me give you a few examples. When we think about the grain deal between Ukraine and Russia, when you think about it, it was extremely transactional. Basically, Russia wanted to please a number of Arab and African countries which needed some grain and had to accept somehow that Ukraine will export also some grain. So it was, and for a couple of times, Russia accepted to prolongate this agreement, this deal, and then one day they concluded that it was no more in its own interest and decided to stop it. We can think about even more interestingly, I would say, the deal which was made maybe only 2 years ago, and it's hard to believe, between Lebanon and Israel. These two countries are at war. Lebanon doesn't recognize the existence of a state of Israel. Nevertheless, with the mediation of the US administration, both countries decided to delimit the maritime border in order for both of them to exploit the gas in the Med Sea. So you see the degree of short-term calculation on each party. And I could multiply a number of examples, and it's always the same. What does it mean? I think it means that it's short-term calculation. It means also that these deals are very fragile. The fact that Putin decided after twice to reconduct the grain deal and stop it means that, you know, the person estimates that it's no more in its own interest and will stop it. So we are moving to a much more fluid situation, and mediation is just a tactical tool. In the past, it was much more part of a philosophy to bring countries to a transition. I think we are no more there. We're at a very, very different place.
Thank you, Pierre. Philippe.
Mostly in agreement. but also don't see it necessarily as problematic. I think it's potentially necessary change that we are witnessing. And if we talk about multipolarity, so in a way, the more systemic solutions we had why it was in the 90s, right? So prior to the 90s, we had bipolar, a two-polar world, where conflict management, overall realist approaches were prevalent in terms of looking into conflict resolution, right? So it wasn't necessarily a solution, but was kind of minimizing potential for destructive nuclear type of war. And then in the 90s, as end of history came, then there was this very short end of history period where it looked like we found an answer, and overall, just as long as we get everybody there, right? So then we can have permanent peace. And there, yes, mediation looked like a piece of a puzzle, but overall, that was leading towards some kind of a more permanent solution. Given that now the debate is that didn't work. The debate isn't necessarily it worked or not. I think that's settled that it didn't. The question is more, was it meant to work, right? It's a theory failure or implementation failure. So on the liberal end, we believe we can return to it essentially, right? On the critical of liberal is that it was never meant to be. It was always a cover for respectively structural violence. So me being on that end somewhat, I think now we are in a place where and we had to arrive anyways, unfortunately, maybe for the rest of us, those of us living, we are in that place, and it is multipolar, it is continually fracturing. That consensus is broken, and I don't see a return to it as being a possibility. We couldn't implement it even in the 90s when there seemed to be a consensus. It's much harder to, I don't see a point even discussing yet how moving back to the 90s as a possibility. So then this multipolarity and hybrid approach becomes necessary, and if we differentiate between counter-resolution, then management and transformation, I think resolution should be almost removed, in my view, from the conversation. Because resolution assumes somehow consensus. It assumes there is some kind of philosophical bigger picture consensus, and then we can eventually, as we achieve that place toward which, around which we agree, right? So then there is like this technocratic means of getting to that end point. Since the end point doesn't simply exist anymore, even philosophically speaking, then I see these two approaches that we need to work on now. One is conflict management, right? This transactional version of it, continual work on that. So minimizing violence, some call it also functional coexistence, specifically when we work with authoritarian states, right? That yes, we'll engage in this kind of transactional approach and somehow changing the calculation where violence is not seen as beneficial. And that should be continual work effectively. While on the other end of the spectrum, focusing on the transformation of relations, transformation of, most importantly, the philosophy of what politics are and how are they going to function against all the background that Topher laid out in the beginning here, right? So with all the changes that are coming, that will not be moving us towards more prosperity and moving us towards more displacement and more violence. So how we are able to build essentially political and social structures, economic structures to sustain all that. That's where I see like this constant work towards again minimizing violence while simultaneously trying to build some philosophical alternatives to Marxism and capitalism effectively as we along with liberal democracy. So it's almost two very different types of work that needs to continue, but like trying to agree on some kind of a solution. Maybe in a case-by-case basis we can, but not necessarily in a global sense anymore. The last piece here for me is that how do we then proceed at all? Yeah, so that becomes somewhat localized, right? So if you don't have an agreement on a global solution or functional solution for everybody, that's where I potentially moved myself away from, and I thought we can accept European blueprint effectively towards some localized, not necessarily in a sense of, you need to go and ask a particular person locally, but more case-specific, let's say, solutions. So in that sense, work much more in collaboration and building off the voices of really peace builders locally, not necessarily even population, but I would say peace builders locally, rather than trying to provide support for that as opposed to trying to impose something which didn't work.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. In this international disorder that certainly fuels this situation where you have more and more transactional deals that subsequently, again, fuel more and more disorders. As you said, I mean, it's a deal. It can stop, it can resume. It gives a lot of unpredictability in all of that. And I think there's been these provocative thoughts of giving war a chance. What is your take on that at this stage? Let's start with Philip this time.
Sorry, I think I missed the question. Can you repeat one more time?
Yeah, the short question is, in this disorder, what about giving war a chance?
Oh, well, that's a step too far for me, in the sense of, I don't, yes, some countries will be, or some groups will be resorting to violence. I came to a peace school with an intention of finding other ways of dealing with conflict. So as from my perspective, we are not necessarily a group that should go in that direction. While anticipating, of course, other actors' rights who are not necessarily bound by some kind of normative commitment to peace that I have made, to continue giving war a chance in sorting their questions differently. So from my perspective, though, we need to provide an alternative, or essentially other forms of engaging in conflict. Conflicts are, in my view, this, as I mentioned, will be escalating as opposed to getting solved as we move forward, right? So then we should have some other forms of dealing with conflict or prosecuting conflict without necessarily increasing violence. So from that perspective, the agonistic peace, for example, right, so one of the post-liberal concepts, I think is an important one, which doesn't look into, should remove solution as a, it will look, work towards solution, sees any kind of permanent peace as actually structural violence on its own, and essentially normalization of a conflict and continual contestation of spaces, even potentially very like aggressive contestation, but not necessarily violent, as the way forward. It can help, I think, with potentially addressing a lot of the challenges that we are facing. So, problem being, it's a very underdeveloped concept. It's more of a concept than necessarily a toolkit or even a methodology. But looking into effectively ways of working with conflict, working with violence, working with power, with not trying to solve it effectively, but trying to channel it through non-violent means. So that's just like one place I see. And if we turn to mediation specifically, I think we should stop looking at it as kind of the answer. I think Pierre has a good point that it's, before it was a piece of a bigger puzzle, but specifically towards a particular end, it still remains a piece of a puzzle, not necessarily a solution on its own. Not every conflict is mediable, not every conflict needs to be addressed through mediation. It's just one particular tool that situationally can be employed. And those of us who are able to do it, yes, in situationally can approach it, but we probably figure out, look, are we contributing to a bigger problem or not? To turn back to the early example I mentioned, right? So yes, even negotiating ceasefire can actually lead to a bigger war. So this kind of a calculation probably should be made in an ethical sense before we do it, because we don't have to do it.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. Yeah.
Yeah, well, apparently there is a Norwegian NGO which counted that there is today 55 active conflicts, and defense spending, is reaching new levels, is $2.4 trillion. I mean, we are reaching new levels. We have 200 million people living under the control, total or partial, of armed groups. There are 120 million people being displaced or refugees. So I'm not sure that we really need to give war a chance. But you are raising a very interesting point. And it's what's the price for peace? And when you think about price for peace, obviously, we know the price of war, and we know the suffering and war crimes and crimes against humanity. And when we tend to think about peace, we just see the rosy picture. In reality, I believe it's much more complicated than that. And it's also one reason I decided to write this book, not the only one, but one of them. because I think there is not enough thinking about the price which is being paid in order to reach peace. Who are the losers? The losers are not only the bad guys. The losers could be women, which are totally forgotten or marginalized. And we can think about a number of situations in Sahel or in Afghanistan. We can think about some justice being sacrificed in order to reach some peace. We can think about human rights. I remember a specific case in Aceh. Both sides, until the very last moments, there were human rights provisions in the peace treaty. But both sides decided, well, we didn't want that. It was not in their favor. So they just forget about them. So we can think about sometimes of very difficult dilemmas, hard choices. And one of them, which happened in Bosnia and also in Syria, is about ethnic cleansing. Are you trying to save lives? And so meaning saving lives means also sometimes trying to help a policy of ethnic cleansing, which is morally unacceptable. But if you don't do anything, then these people might die as a result. So we see that the price for peace is something which is not so obvious. And I think we need some time to find and to reflect hard about who is going to pay for that price.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think it was a lot has been said, and I think we can perhaps open the floor for some questions at this stage. Tolfa.
Yes, I'll just cast about the review. I don't think that you have a panoptic view here, so I'll just look around. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to pose to the speakers? Alex? I definitely have questions, so I'll
Can you hear me from here?
Yes, this is our dean, Dr. Darren Q.
Hi, guys. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for this really important talk. I think, successful peace processes have always been a three-level chess game, and sort of the neoliberal moment of the sort of last 20, 25 years. Even in our best case, scenarios when we had successful peace processes, you had to have the global level lineup where global powers were facilitating some sort of a deal, or at least not getting in the way of it. At the state level, you had to have the key state level actors ready to come to some sort of a deal. And at the societal level, civil society had to be sort of working from the bottom up to bring things together. And even in the best of times, getting all three of those layers lined up on this three-level chess game is tremendously difficult. We don't have a lot of great success stories out there that show that. And so from what I'm hearing, what you all are saying, we're a little bit sort of back to the future in the sense that we're back to the Cold War, or even the sort of 1930s, where at the global level, we have a far more competitive environment with the Security Council locked up again because of great power, disinterest. At the state level, we're seeing sort of democracy on the run at the moment. That leaves the civil society level at the moment in terms of where the action is. And by civil society, I don't just mean NGOs. I mean everything from religious institutions, trade unions, business associations, and so on. So all sort of civic life there in those kinds of actors. Based on your experience, thinking about sort of technological changes and that sort of thing, can civil society cannot carry an entire process themselves. But at this moment, given sort of the locking up of the machine at the two higher levels, can civil society still move the ball further maybe than it could have in the past? Do you see any sort of opportunities there that civil society can do to kind of at least create, I hate to use these words, sort of safe havens, You know, to create at least sort of some sort of a safety net that can hold out or at least, you know, move things a little bit further until, you know, that middle level of the state actors or the global level sort of unlock to try to sort of help move the process forward at some point. Do you have any hope there, or are we still sort of, are we back in the 1980s?
So thank you for the question. I don't think we are back though. I think we are kind of, you know, in the whole new territory. Back maybe in the sense of it's multipolar and not necessarily there is no consensus about some kind of a happily ever after, but really where the power lies or the communication processes work is very different from that period. I think that even thinking back, we are as messy as a back we can think of, we are still thinking of some kind of state dominant space, right? So whether it's empires, you know, of like 19th, 20th century stuff, or even earlier 20th, right? Or nation states, but we're thinking of state as an actor, or main actor, which are still, of course, but that power is receding, right? So we are not thinking about Anderson or other forms of, or even through Tilly's versions of state. It's not necessarily there, right? So, AI one thing, but also like, you know, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos probably have more power in any sense than any state, and soon probably like more or potentially even this particular state. So really the way communication functions, the way identities function is completely shifting. So I think we are not necessarily fully accounting for that. So I don't see that as a back. That's one. And I see that necessity also rethinking, realigning what politics means, what relations mean. So that's more like, I think it's still forward rather than back, which makes it harder because we don't have necessarily blueprint against which to work. Climate change, again, was never necessarily such a big driving factor the way we have here for displacement. To your question specifically about civil society, I think maybe more, as a result, more than that. As a result, yeah, because the state's role gonna be weakening, then somebody's role gonna be increasing. And but again, not as an NGO sector. As an NGO sector, no, I think that role is also necessarily going down because these are effectively, by definition, implementers of somebody else's, mostly states or other funders will, right? So in that sense, the civil side in a broader sense, especially communication, those who control communication, probably the role is growing. So now whether academics can get a front of it, right? So there's movements that are really able to utilize this, but not necessarily NGOs, not institutionalized ones, because they are kind of prime targets for cooperation. But yeah, I see the other actors necessarily emerging, and we could be quite strategic about see if they are working with them.
Well, I would like to mention two examples in which I think civil society is playing a major role. I was involved for many years in the Sahel region. And, you know, in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, basically, the states have collapsed. And we have hundreds of micro conflicts basically regarding raw materials. Because of climate change, herders are almost obliged to go on farming territories, which is creating in turn so many conflicts, basically from Senegal to the whole continent to the very east. So we are talking about, I mean, basically hundreds of conflicts. And what was really interesting for me is to see the team I was working with, which were only local people, trying to make peace agreements regarding access to water and access to farming lands. And the way these agreements, these peace agreements between communities were being struck was just so different than our Western approach. Sometimes the two villages came together, and for 3 days, it was a very open discussions. And it lasted basically days until there was an agreement being reached. And obviously, when when one community is able to make a deal with another community, that's great and it's working. And then, because the situation is pretty unstable, when there is a third actor which is coming, then it's becoming extremely fragile. So it's just a very limited peace agreement because basically the state has collapsed and it's not possible to replace the state. But nevertheless, something is happening at the local level. Another, I think, interesting phenomenon for me is what's happening with hate speech. I've seen at least in two places. One is Bosnia and Herzegovina. The second is central Nigeria, where civil society has basically accepted a code of conduct to limit hate speech. So it's not perfect, but I think we are, as I think Philip was saying, we are entering in new territories with technology, with communications, with digital, all the digital world. And we need also trying to think about new tools. Let me give you an example. What is an electronic ceasefire or digital ceasefire? I don't know, but we need to find out. So I think we are entering in a new era, and I think it's just fascinating. Let's think also about something which is unprecedented, is COVID. Who has imagined that one day there will be a number of ceasefire in order for to access population under armed groups? And it's what happened because it was necessary to access to give vaccines to this population. So on the one hand, the division, the fragmentation of the world is extremely worrying. On the other hand, we see interesting new phenomena, new trends, new tools being developed.
Thank you. And yes, please.
There's a wide gap between what the people, society in general wants in terms of peace, stability, to what happens at the global level war. If we look at even the amount of money that's spent on peace, UN's budget is 6.1 billion. The world spends close to $2.5 trillion on war. What chance does peace stand against such kind of financial clout? Like, what should the peace lobby do with its piddly budget and resources?
That's only a budget issue. Actually, I think it's, if we knew what they're doing, we would get more money. I don't think the resources are necessarily the question. I also don't necessarily accept the premise that people don't want conflict. I mean, just look right now today. Also, you know, the rhetoric in the elections, right? So like it's quite violent and gets a lot of support. So there isn't necessarily. So I haven't seen necessarily any evidence that you leave it to people and they just suddenly go for peace. No, they very much can go for violence over and over, right? So that's one. So essentially, why though? I think we need to understand the why, right? So it's either limited resources or perception of limited resources or perception of threat. So then all of this calculation should be changed in some form, right? So or identity basis, political identity being, you know, quite again, all nationalism being somewhat by default exclusive East, and then violent in the sense of protecting your group, and yet you cannot do anything with nationalism as long as nation state is the main structure, right? So there is, I think, a lot of quite structural reasons to continue functioning in a system where you need to maximize or somehow, you know, get enough resources for your group to survive, and the group should be small enough to be able to somehow sustain it. So I think, yeah, I don't. In my view, is not the resource issue. I think, at least in cases I've seen where there was a lot of money sent to the peace building, there was a lot of not knowing what to do and replication of quite non-effective, to put it mildly, initiatives. There's a lot of money wasting. So I don't think it's just a resource issue. I think it's ideas in a big sense in a way, right? So I think like outside of like the Marxism that was completely failed in my view, challenge to the current problems. So we became more violent than what they have now, right? Over and over. So we don't have necessarily much of a alternative political thought here. So I think once we have it, I don't see a problem being in the resources.
Well, I just agree with what Philip has said, actually.
Other questions?
About like, as you were like showing in the video about the seminar, about you were talking about the BRICS summit in Russia recently, and it changed like how like any international theories doesn't work in terms of like let's say liberal theories like be aggressive, do something bad for other countries or try to occupy, and all other nations isolate this aggressor and sanctions and sort of different tools try to like minimize their power, but in reality you can see that there are a lot of countries, like a couple dozen countries come to the Russia and support. I mean like symbolically support their presence, and it shows that Russia is not isolated. So how it can affect Russia going once again more towards the peace and negotiation talks, or it's gonna showing that wars continues ongoing. Like even UN Secretary General, the one of the like high level position person from the West participation, how do you see it can affect international relations and Western perspective and international relations perspective?
Pierre, Bruno, did you hear this question?
It was very difficult for me to hear it. I just heard, yeah, no, I didn't actually.
If I can summarize it, and you can tell me if I'm doing this justice or not. I think that the nutshell version of this question is that the international system, as it was set up, was intended in a liberal sense to be able to isolate illiberal bad actors and to punish them with a gradient of sanctions, etc., diplomatic punishments, and that what we are seeing now is perhaps the erosion of this liberal order, where any bad actor will actually find a sort of small coterie of actors with whom they resonate or with whom they have transactional interests, and there is no isolating any longer. So this is not necessarily did I sort of capture that? Okay.
And the BRICS.
It's true. I mean, obviously, when we read that, for instance, in northern Mali, Ukrainians were able to ambush Russian mercenaries who are entering in the new world, and local wars are becoming more global. That's obviously one dimension. And it's true, the question of norms are being questioned today, and we see that international justice is being put to the test. And we'll see if the ICC will survive. And in the same time, it's hard also not to see the criticism of the ICC, the first decision being taken by the current prosecutor was to abandon any investigations against the Americans in Afghanistan. So basically, the norms do exist, but sometimes they are also being used and sometimes abused. Then the question is what to do when you have war criminals and you want to basically strike a deal. So that's a very almost traditional, classical dilemma, the peace versus justice question. And there are a lot of different answers. One of them is to work whenever it's possible. So you start by reparation, you start by something which is not getting on the way to peace, and slowly you are introducing new elements of justice. And at one point, you can possibly reach retributive justice. And we have a lot of examples of that sort. You can also, and I think it's an interesting evolution. You know, in the late 90s, there was the war in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And basically 200,000 people were killed. And the international community created a hybrid tribunal. Only 12 people were indicted, and only 9 were sentenced, meaning that the rest got basically off the hook. So you can do a lot of things which is still more or less in agreement with international law. So we need a degree of pragmatism, a degree of flexibility, and whenever you can, you are injecting elements of different justice, and justice cannot be reduced to its criminal or retributive dimension. It's much richer, and it includes also reparations and fact findings and some kind of truth. So that's part of a larger of understanding of what justice is about.
Yeah, I again agree, throwing a couple of things, where it became easier for me to look past in a way, yeah, liberalism, liberal peace, whatever, which is because we want an answer, it's very disorienting not to have it, is kind of accepting that, for my thought, that so first of all, that is not necessarily a peace actor, it could be peace actor whenever it would benefit, right? So that's why for me the breaking point was less Libya, 2011, which makes sense. In a somewhat technical sense, but more like Iraq 2003, right? Probably where we just and then everything you mentioned, and then essentially effectively not refusal, but inability of any international system to prosecute any case that involves US, or is not being signatory of any of the treaties to that extent. The second, accept then that BRICS and all these other so isolation, dual isolation is just simply not possible because, right? So it's the system essentially that it is works for me since I live now in the US, right? But it is otherwise quite violent towards others, and then yeah, some are, can take sides, but it's inevitable essentially the formation of alternatives because again, there see the question of injustice. So from there on, again, as a tactically, I go back to let's deal with whoever, so in a very practical, pragmatic sense, it's Russia or Hamas or whoever it is. But bigger question then is the justice. I think really is an important one because and the conception of it, right? What is peace? What is justice? How this to work? Not an accident. Here we are in the school of peace and justice, trying to somehow negotiate between these two because they can be quite contradictory, right? In present day understanding. And again, I don't see the solution to it. I think it's a continual work, but just we cannot solve the problem through isolation of Russia or anybody else. Hopefully, it's obvious.
I would also like to maybe use whatever prerogative I have here to inject one element in here that I think is maybe a little bit missing. I do think that we've discussed. I think evoked very well this idea that perhaps during the 90s there was this moment where we believed that empires had evolved to nation states would evolve to a global government and perhaps a standing UN army, and there would be this sort of all the nation's government or the world's governmental challenges would be unitary and solved. And we perhaps touched it and then we didn't quite grasp it, and so we've fallen back down into nationalism, and we're perhaps like falling through nationalism again, back down into an age of perhaps expanded empire. Those of you in my course, I will have recognized that I gave you the Bruce Gilley's recent article, The Case for Colonialism. Let's bring that back. We see rising materials prices for things like tungsten, manganese, lithium, rare earth metals, driving, and what I'm wondering here is that one of the organs that has rushed in to fill this vacuum that you were talking about, Phil, is not civil society, as you mentioned, it's corporations. Corporations are now have a preeminent role in take Mozambique, where gigantic mining concessions have been made by a government which is basically bought off and is granting these huge concessions. It's the corporation, it's also corporations, we might add, that are the incubators for artificial intelligence. And it's corporations who have traditionally felt very, very comfortable with mediation, right? They're the ones who make us sign these clauses that we will not take them to court, we'll mediate with them, right? So here are these corporate actors, say like Starlink in Ukraine, dictating in some sense like the terms on which a conflict can even be fought in the first place. They are incubating AI, they are coming into contact with masses of people on the ground in places where they are given mining concessions, and they're doing so empowered with a super intelligence increasingly. So that's just a whole lot of, that's a lot of a big ball of maybe negativity that I'm just gonna like, how do you see our responsibility to engage corporate actors in this new age?
Thanks for making us carry your burden, Topher.
I don't, obviously not gonna give you an answer in a minute, I'm not gonna have it, but as in a quick, initial thought that we don't think of corporations as political actors as such, yes, so when we are, should start thinking of it in political, not just political actors, but also political spaces, effectively, right? So I think this is, it's almost, we talk about, even then we talk in all terms about corporate social responsibility and this and that, somehow it still assumes some kind of social control, kind of within the nation state system that we can potentially be, right? So this isn't necessarily how it works anymore. So I think increasingly thinking of it as almost the next empire, right? Or that could potentially help think, but I don't have an answer, but we agree with the challenge, so. Hopefully.
Yeah, any last
yeah,
thoughts?
better, yeah. You're muted.
Pierre, you're on mute.
I think there is obviously today a scramble for Africa, a new one happening with Russia, China, and so many different actors. And what we see in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is just what you describe, this reality in which one country has a lot of very strategic materials and which is basically so important to decide on the future of so many people. And yes, that's also a new, we need to reflect about it's very new type of colonialism, and I think it's what you were alluding earlier. The question also, and it's quite interesting to see that this new technology is also being used by human rights organizations. I'm thinking about what happened in Myanmar or in Sudan. And it's true that the destruction, the level of destruction was exemplified by or was shown by satellites used by Human Rights Watch and others. So we have a more complex, technology basically is neutral and could be used in so many different ways. And yes, I will stop here.
Perfect, thank you. Bruno, do you have any closing thoughts before we give everybody their time here?
Changing nature of conflict and changing nature of negotiations, I guess. Yeah.
Well,
thanks a lot. I think it was fascinating having both Philippe and Pierre, and thanks a lot to the Kroc School to give us this opportunity to have this open discussion a little bit outside perhaps of the curriculum. Thanks a lot, Topher.
Oh, thank you, Bruno, for the idea. Thank you, Pierre, for joining us and for your time.